For centuries, this place did not disappear. It endured by remaining partially buried. Stone walls collapsed. Sand drifted in. Rooms slowly filled. And instead of destroying the city, those layers protected it. What survived at Chaco Canyon did so quietly, shielded from wind, from water, from constant human contact. When the site entered the modern world, that silence became a problem. Archaeologists could not see what lay beneath the surface. Managers could not assess the condition of hidden structures. The public could not understand a city they could barely access. Leaving Chaco buried meant accepting uncertainty. So a different idea took hold. That excavation was not disturbance, but responsibility. That carefully opening the ground would allow the past to be studied, stabilized, and protected. Digging was framed as care, a way to save what time had preserved, but concealed. At this stage, nothing had gone wrong. The assumption was simple and widely accepted. If these structures survived for centuries underground, they could survive once carefully brought into the open. And that belief leads to the first question of this story. When does protecting the past require us to intervene at all? At Chaco Canyon, intervention began carefully. Not everywhere, not all at once. Specific areas were selected. Rooms believed to be stable. Spaces that could be documented, reinforced, and monitored. Excavation moved downward, through collapsed masonry, through windblown sand, toward the original floors of the city. In some locations, the digging reached 10 to 15 feet below the modern ground level. This was the moment the site stopped being uniform. Excavated rooms now sat lower than surrounding ground. Unexcavated rooms remained filled. Walls that had been supported by soil on all sides were exposed on one and unsupported on the other. Nothing dramatic happened. No collapse. No visible failure. But the intervention had crossed a threshold. The work was no longer about revealing history. It was actively reshaping how the ground behaved. Gravity mattered more. Water followed new paths. Soil began to move in directions it never had before. The excavation had not uncovered a hidden problem in the ancient city. It had created a new physical condition, one that had never existed. During the centuries, the site remained buried. And that leads to the second question. At what point does intervention stop being observation and start becoming transformation? The consequences did not arrive as a single event. They emerged through ordinary conditions, acting on a changed environment. Rainfall was the first test. Water no longer moved across the surface as it once had. Excavated rooms now sat lower than surrounding ground, and water followed gravity downward into spaces that had been dry for centuries. Moisture began to collect where it never had before. At the same time, another force appeared. Soil left inside unexcavated rooms began pressing sideways against exposed walls. Those walls had been stable when supported on all sides. They were not designed to absorb uneven pressure. These were not ancient stresses revealed by excavation. They were new, created by the act of digging itself. Nothing collapsed. There was no sudden failure to point to, but measurements changed. Drainage patterns shifted. Structural risk increased. The system that had remained stable underground for hundreds of years was no longer operating under the same rules. The excavation had not uncovered a fragile city. It had placed a stable one into conditions it had never evolved to withstand. And that leads to the third question. If human intervention creates new risks, how much change can a preserved site endure before protection itself becomes the danger? The changes were no longer happening underground alone. They were happening at the surface. As the site became more accessible, people began to move through spaces that had once been sealed. Footsteps followed new paths. Trails formed where none had existed. Visitors stood where the ground had only recently been uncovered. Each step seemed insignificant, but the environment was not built for constant contact. Soil compacted under repeated use. Vegetation disappeared. Water runoff accelerated along new routes. And where people gathered, the impact multiplied. This was not vandalism. It was not neglect. It was presence. Even careful movement introduced friction. Even respectful access changed how the site aged. The city was now responding not only to excavation, but to exposure, to weather, to gravity, to people. And that raised a new question. If a site begins to change simply by being visited, how much access is too much? At Chaco Canyon, there was no single moment when everything changed. No collapse. No emergency. What changed was the accumulation. Excavation altered the ground. Exposure altered how the site aged. And human presence accelerated both. Individually, each impact seemed manageable. Together, they were not. Site managers and researchers began to recognize a limit, not imposed by policy, but by physics. Some areas could no longer be opened without increasing risk. Others required partial reburial to slow further deterioration. Access was reduced. Movement was redirected. And in certain places, work simply stopped. Not because the site was understood, but because continuing would permanently alter what remained. This was not a retreat from science. It was an adjustment to reality. That preservation does not always mean bringing the past closer. Sometimes, it means creating distance. At Chaco Canyon, protection became an act of restraint, an acceptance that understanding has limits, and that crossing them can erase the very evidence we seek to preserve. And that brings us to the final question. If preservation requires stopping, then how do we protect places like this while still allowing people who care about them to understand them